OsteoSignal Episode 37.
The tissue you treat was built with metals. Everything we've discussed in this series, the fascia, the tendons, the mitochondria, the autonomic system, the collagen that either remodels or doesn't, was assembled from raw materials, and some of those raw materials are metals. Not metaphorically, literally. The fascia underneath your hands right now contains copper atoms incorporated into its molecular crosslinks. The mitochondria powering the tenocytes, right, the cells that build your tendons, trying to repair a tendinopathy, are built around iron. The zinc atoms embedded in the active sites of more than 300 enzymes in that tissue are doing the catalytic work that turns a mechanical signal into a structural adaptation. We treat the body as though it is already complete, as though the only question is how to organize what's there. But the body is not a finished product. It is a living forge, continuously building, remodeling, repairing, and rebuilding from raw materials. And if the forge is running low on copper, zinc, magnesium, selenium, or iron, the quality of everything it produces is compromised. Silently, in ways that don't show up on standard imaging or routine blood panels, in ways that show up under our hands.
This is OsteoSignal with Neil O'Neill, a podcast exploring how osteopathic science can help you decode the body's biomechanical, biochemical, and bioelectrical signals so you can thrive. And now, here's Neil.
Welcome back to the OsteoSignal podcast. My name is Neil O'Neill. I'm a clinical osteopathic manual therapist and physical therapist. My work focuses on translating complex physiology, neuroendocrine signaling, biomechanics, immune regulation, and nervous system function into hands-on clinical methods that help restore adaptive capacity in patients. Much of my perspective comes from years of clinical practice combined with training in translational research, where the goal is to bridge the gap between laboratory science and what actually helps people recover function in the clinic. Joining me is Autumn Mayberry, a fellow osteopathic manual therapist whose work focuses on integrating structural treatment with the body's autonomic, endocrine, and visceral systems. Autumn brings a deep clinical perspective to these discussions and helps ground many of the concepts we talk about in real patient care. And hey Autumn. And helping guide the conversation is Brent Mayberry, our podcast facilitator. Brent is an engineer by training, which makes him the perfect person to ask the kinds of questions that many listeners are probably already thinking, helping translate some of the deeper physiological concepts into a language that is clear, practical, and understandable. Hey, Brent.
Hi there, Neil. Excited to talk about the living forge.
Yes, this will be interesting. So today we're talking about metallic micronutrients, specifically what each one is doing structurally in the tissue that we treat. And that includes patients who are stretching or using the massage gun on themselves. What is it that's going on in that tissue? And what a clinician or the patient should look for when the forge isn't getting what it needs. This is not a supplement episode. This is a structural biology episode that happens to involve elements from the periodic table. Okay, so iron and copper, the structural pair. So we've talked about iron across multiple episodes in this series, its role in dopamine synthesis, thyroid hormone production, mitochondrial respiration, and collagen cross-linking. Iron is the metal we've spent the most time on, and rightly so. But today, I want to start with something about iron that most clinicians don't know. You can have adequate iron stores and still be functionally iron deficient if you don't have enough copper. Here's why. Iron moves around the body attached to a transport protein called transferrin. But for iron to load onto transferrin, it has to be in the correct oxidative state, what we call ferric iron, or Fe3+, meaning it has 3 positive charges, or at once 3 electrons, if you will. The enzyme that performs this conversion is called ceruloplasmin. Ceruloplasmin, there we go. Ceruloplasmin is a copper-containing enzyme, that's the cerulo. Without adequate copper, ceruloplasmin function is impaired. Iron cannot load onto transferrin efficiently, and iron accumulates in cells. It particularly accumulates in liver cells and macrophages, while the tissues that need it run short. That's not where we want it, those liver cells and macrophages. The ferritin level looks normal or even elevated. The transferrin saturation is low. The patient has all the clinical signs of functional iron deficiency. But supplementing iron doesn't help because the problem isn't the iron supply. It is the copper-dependent transport system.
So you can have all the iron you want in a body, right? And because you don't have enough copper to facilitate that transport, that you're missing that piece to make
Exactly.
make the transfer and do its job.
Exactly. And that's the clinical trap exactly. Iron supplementation without adequate copper is like filling a fuel tank when the fuel pump is broken. The iron is there, the delivery system isn't, which is why in a patient with persistent functional iron deficiency that isn't responding to iron repletion, the next question should be about copper status, not a higher iron dose. I just had a patient come in the other day. I was like, well, this iron's not really working. I think I'm going to go to try and get an infusion. And I had to like, hold on, let's go check your micronutrients here. It's time to pay for another test or to ask your doctor for another test. But copper's most direct osteosignal relevance is in its role in an enzyme called lysyl oxidase, which we've talked about before. This is the enzyme that creates the crosslinks between collagen fiber and between elastin fibers, the molecular welds that give connective tissue its tensile strength and its elastic recoil, right? It makes a bunch of lines into a netting, and then that netting is interactive. Lysyl oxidase is a copper-dependent enzyme. Without it, collagen forms but isn't properly cross-linked. Individual fibers are present, but the architecture is weak. The tissue has volume but not strength. Now, what that feels like when you palpate that is that there's adequate bulk in the tissue, but inadequate resilience. It's not the dense, contracted feel of a well cross-linked but restricted fascia. It's closer to dough. It yields, but it doesn't spring back. It might eventually pull back, but more of a hysteresis or slow movement of the tissue. The elastic recoil is absent. And when you load it mechanically, it doesn't rebound the way healthy cross-linked connective tissue does. For example, when a patient is exercising, they'll feel like they're walking in sand or walking in water, and then they'll exercise and they're just like, yeah, it's just like, I'm so weighted down. I'm just spinning my wheels. In a copper deficient patient, the fascia's mechanical properties are compromised not because of restriction, but because of inadequate molecular architecture. The crosslinks were never fully made.
I just had this on my table a couple of times this morning, and it was interesting because I was like, "Why is it doing this?" Right? When you push into them and they're just not quite. It's like they don't respond. They're like, "Eh," we woke up a little bit, but we didn't get out of bed, kind of thing. And I even feel it sometimes. I even feel it sometimes around the organs when we do visceral work. Is that possible around the organs too? Because I'm like, they just feel like they're kind of, you know. I don't know.
Yeah,
That's not even scientific work, but
yeah, no, entirely. I mean, I think that's just it. Is all the connective tissue, uh, all the support tissue, and at some level, ligaments and tendons as well. That you're going to feel that it moves, but it doesn't spring back. It's not that healthy tissue that you expect to feel.
yeah, yeah.
And then that's when patients are going to have weird tendon and ligament injuries or weird muscular injuries where they're just like, yeah, it hurts, it aches, I work it out. I don't know. It just doesn't, I don't feel that like, hey, I feel way better. I worked out yesterday. I'm feeling great today. They're just kind of like, I don't feel good for my workout.
It's like a lack of elasticity.
Exactly it. So, and beyond fascia, copper is required for the myelin sheaths that insulate peripheral nerves. Aha, here's another problem here. Through its role in cytochrome C oxidase and in the enzymes that synthesize myelin lipids. Now, remember, myelin sheaths are the things that make nerves work faster, right? So that signals move faster. Well, if you slow down that signal is either lost, can be changed, it can be reduced. So, again, part of that, I feel like I'm spinning my wheels, I'm walking in water. The tissue doesn't want to pop back because the nerves that innervate the area just don't have their normal feedback mechanisms. Um, so it's a real problem. In a copper deficient patient, neural conduction slows. Proprioception is impaired. The feedback loop from mechanoreceptors to the brainstem that we've discussed in the autonomic episodes is running on degraded wiring. The mechanical signal enters the tissue, but the neural translation is lossy, right? And lossy refers to a data compression method that reduces file size by permanently discarding non-essential or imperceptible data. The problem is they're really non-essential. So the information coming through is a smaller file for the computer. Um, it makes it great for web and streaming, but anybody that's ever posted a picture or like if you copied a picture from offline, you go, oh, that's a nice clear picture. And then you put it on your computer, like that's blurry. Yeah, exactly. When you really look at the quality of it, it's very poor. So that's lossy. And that's exactly what you get with the neural transmission or the translation. It's just you get information it's there, but it's just not enough to really have something to work on. Okay, so
Well, now I know in the future I'm going to have these patients check for iron because you can feel it for sure.
the iron, and then certainly the copper, right?
I
So
mean, sorry, the copy. The
the
copper, that's what I
copper.
meant to say. Copper. Take that part out,
And
Brent.
all right.
I knew exactly what I meant. I didn't say it right at all.
No, that's fine. I know what you meant. So let's talk about zinc and magnesium, the architect and the activator, right? Zinc is introduced in most clinical education as an immune mineral. Take zinc when you have a cold. Zinc lozenges, zinc supplements for immune support. That framing is accurate, but dramatically incomplete. Zinc is a structural element in a way that most people don't appreciate. It is incorporated into the three-dimensional structure of proteins, not as a cofactor sitting loosely in an active site, but as an architectural component that determines the physical shape of the protein itself. And we've talked about this, that the protein, as it's being made, begins folding. And the zinc is going to help decide that it folds to be an effective protein as opposed to an ineffective protein. And we've talked about this, like you can have an isomer, or you can have a cis isomer that is in the active form, say of a T3 that we've talked about, and that the trans isomer, reverse T3, is completely inactive and doesn't do anything for the body. Right. So there's a perfect example. Now, zinc helps that folding, but if you're low on zinc, that may be one of the reasons you're going towards reverse T3. We'll talk about that some more here in a second. Okay, so
Now you've mentioned in the past that the shape of the protein determines its function,
exactly.
right? Yeah.
Yes.
So
And so if we don't get the right shape, we don't get the right function of our proteins. So then you're making proteins all the time, but they're not worthwhile proteins, or they're not the effective proteins. They're less effective. Okay, so these zinc-containing structural proteins are called zinc finger proteins. Yes, finger. And they regulate gene expression by physically gripping the strands of the DNA. Kind of interesting here. So these zinc fingers will grip the strand of the DNA. Without zinc, the zinc finger can't form. Without the zinc finger, the transcription machinery can't read the gene. In other words, you won't be able to make the proteins. Without gene expression, the protein that the gene encodes, collagen, a repair enzyme, an immune signaling molecule, is never made. Okay? For the tissue repair context, that matters most in our practice. Zinc is required for fibroblast proliferation. The fibroblast is the cell that makes collagen. When tissue is injured, right, the repair cascade requires fibroblasts to replicate rapidly at the injury site, synthesize new collagen, and organize it into functional architecture. Zinc deficiency slows fibroblast proliferation, reduces collagen synthesis, and extends the inflammatory phase of healing. Because the transition from inflammation to repair requires zinc-dependent enzymatic activity. A patient with chronically low zinc doesn't just heal slowly. Their healing gets stuck in the inflammatory phase and doesn't advance into productive repair, what we call chronic fatigue or chronic myofascial pain or fibromyalgia, some of these things. Now, for those who are kind of aware, there's a GHKCU, and the CU stands for copper, is a peptide that some people are using. Some people are using it topically. Some people are injecting it to help with their collagen. So it's one of the peptides. We'll talk about that in the near future here. That's one of the reasons that peptide is so effective, because it has a copper atom right with it, so that you're getting the zinc and the copper, or you can take your zinc and you can get your copper right there, and with your protein. So you start folding things properly right off the bat. You get your cross linking. So that's one of the reasons that some of these peptides that we'll be talking about more in the future are so effective and so important for some patients. Okay.
Cool.
Yeah, and it would, we'll talk more about that. But thinking about, like, if this GHKCU or taking zinc, and here's the thing: you're going to have to take the zinc and the copper together. But let's get to that. Okay, the clinical signature of zinc insufficiency in connective tissue is prolonged inflammatory response with inadequate structural progress. Again, that's those patients that come in to see us and we work on them, or these people that go to a massage and they say, yeah, I hurt for four days after that. Or I did a workout and I was still achy and my muscles just didn't feel good for 3, 4, 5 days. It took a really long time to recover. The tissue is swollen and tender longer than expected. Scar tissue that forms is poorly organized. Fascial restrictions that develop post-injury are dense and fibrotic rather than organized. The immune system is activated, but the construction crew hasn't arrived. And so let's talk about those patients who have had a recent surgery, PRP or stem cells, or a recent surgery like a total knee replacement. I see this in total knee replacement all the time. And they're just having such a hard time recovering. And the doc's going, well, yeah, keep doing your PT, keep doing your exercises. Like, this is not an exercise thing, unless it's taking zinc, lifting zinc into your mouth. That's your exercise. And that's really what we want to bring to people's attention is, look, these things can be very important. You can't rehab if you don't have zinc. Now, magnesium, let's switch over to magnesium, that operates at a different level in this system. Most practitioners know magnesium as a muscle relaxant, right? It's important for preventing cramps, regulating neuromuscular transmission, and maintaining the resting membrane potential of muscle cells. All of that is true, so it's really good for muscle recovery. But the deeper reason magnesium is essential is that ATP, the universal cellular energy currency, doesn't function in its free form in cells. Okay? This might be some new information for people. ATP
Yeah.
ATP is active as magnesium ATP. So magnesium is the metal that activates ATP. Every enzymatic reaction that requires ATP energy is actually requiring magnesium ATP or MgATP, which means that magnesium deficiency impairs every process that depends on ATP, including what we call the circuit pump that removes calcium from the muscle cell after contraction. Let's say you're doing a heavy workout or you're doing the Murph, right? And you need your muscles to contract on and off and on and off, or you're cycling, or you're doing anything ultra. The sodium potassium ATPase, right? The thing that breaks down ATP that maintains cellular membrane potential, the protein kinases that drive intracellular signaling, and the collagen synthesis machinery itself all require this. Now, what magnesium deficiency looks like clinically, muscle that is chronically contracted and resistant to relaxation, even when the underlying mechanical restriction is addressed. So as opposed to the other tissue we were feeling, right, where it was copper deficient and it's doughy and non-responsive, and it kind of eventually comes back, the magnesium, the tissue that doesn't have enough magnesium is going to feel like that tissue that just will not relax no matter what you do to it. You're thinking, man, I did my strain counter strain, I did my this. The patient, rolls on the ball, or they do their stretches, or they use the massage gun, and then like, I just can't get this to relax. It won't let go. That's what a magnesium, a lack of magnesium would look like, right? It's just not working. See, so elevated resting neuromuscular tone, right, is what we would call that, high tone. That doesn't normalize between sessions. So the people that say, I just have these chronically tight hamstrings, they never let go. The patient who stretches and stretches and the muscle always returns to the same short, tight state. Part of that picture is mechanical. Part of it is that circuit pump we were talking about, SERCA, dependent on MgATP or magnesium ATP. And it's not efficiently recycling calcium out of the muscle cell, and the cell is staying in partial contractile state biochemically. Okay, so yeah, that's the magnesium, the zinc. Those are very important. I don't think people have necessarily realized that. Like, what exactly does that look like? And you're going to see this in your workouts or even just your daily activities. But there's a couple more here. Let's go through selenium, manganese, and the oxidative environment. So 2 more metals worth naming because they sit at the intersection of the OsteoSignal framework and the repair environment. Selenium is incorporated into a class of proteins called selenoproteins, and the most clinically relevant of these is glutathione peroxidase. How many of you out there are taking glutathione? One of the primary enzymatic antioxidants in human cells. During inflammation, whether from injury, infection, or chronic metabolic stress, the immune response generates reactive oxygen species, right, ROS, as part of the antimicrobial machinery. This oxidative burst is necessary and functional in the short term, right? It works great to kill bugs. But when it persists chronically, reactive oxygen species damage cell membranes, impair mitochondrial function, and degrade the extracellular matrix. Glutathione peroxidase is what scavenges those reactive species and prevents them from causing collateral damage. However, without selenium, that GPX function is impaired, right? That glutathione peroxidase, GPX. That glutathione peroxidase function is impaired. The oxidative environment is in inflamed tissue becomes destructive rather than regulated, right? We do want inflammation in the tissue because we want it to heal and become stronger to adapt to whatever it is we're doing. But rather than regulated, rather than it becomes destructive rather than being regulated, and cellular and structural damage accumulates beyond what the inflammatory process was intended to produce, right? So you want inflammation, but then you need that inflammation to go away. And if you don't have the appropriate amount of selenium, It just doesn't go away. Now, in the context of the iron and thyroid episodes, right, selenium is also a required cofactor for the deiodinase enzymes, right? The iodine enzymes that convert T4 to active T3. We've discussed how T4 to T3 conversion is a critical step in thyroid function and how its impairment produces subclinical hypothyroidism with a normal TSH. If selenium is deficient, that conversion step is biochemically limited, regardless of how much T4 is produced. Selenium is the bridge between the thyroid's output and the tissue's ability to use it, right? It's one of those, you don't hear too much about it, but when you don't have it, it's a problem. Now, manganese is less discussed, but specifically relevant to two structures that manual therapists work with constantly: bone and synovial joints. Now, patients don't realize, but yes, your bone and your synovial joints. And uh, the synovial joints are what really get inflamed anytime like your knee flares up. The synovium gets irritated, and manganese is involved. It is a cofactor for the glycosyl transferases, the enzymes that build the proteoglycan components of cartilage and synovial fluid. And think about that. One of the things that doctors are doing right now when somebody has, like, say, a bad knee, is they'll actually go in, they will inject a proteoglycan, a hyaluronic acid, into the knee to help protect it. But did we check the manganese before we did that? Appropriate supplementation with manganese or manganese repletion might keep us from needing that, or we'll take that hyaluronic acid injection and make it work far better because now the synovial fluid will be appropriate. Now, proteoglycans are the large water-attracting molecules that give cartilage its compressive resistance and synovial fluid its viscous, lubricating quality. And remember, your joints don't rub bone to bone. They actually ride on a thin film of fluid. So when we look at an X-ray, there should be a space there. Well, if you don't have the appropriate amount of manganese, you're going to lose that spacing because that ability of the cartilage to resist compression, and then to keep the synovial fluid, to keep its viscous lubricating quality. It is the synovial fluid that's making sure that space is open, right? So here's a big place where before we do hyaluronic acid, we should be checking manganese levels. Now, and in this case, in manganese depletion, the joint doesn't articulate as smoothly, right? People go, "Oh yeah, I keep getting this cracking, popping, moving. I sound like an 80-year-old." The compressive load is transmitted less efficiently through the cartilage, right? From bone to cartilage to fluid to cartilage to bone. It's less efficient because, again, you start banging bony parts into each other. So over time, this accelerates the degenerative changes that make joints painful and restricted, right? And then, of course, now we're way down the line, but that doesn't mean that manganese repletion isn't necessary. We have to look for this. This is why it's just better to do one of those complete blood panels, and we'll do a podcast on this. I'm offering to people, I'm talking to them about superpower and functional health right now, and those are the most important to me. They're very broad. There's some other ones. Good Labs is less expensive. It's totally a la carte, but then that way, ideally, you do all the numbers and can really look at it and get an idea like, hey, do you have functional iron deficiency and why? There's lots of whys. Like, yeah, you have plenty of, you don't have enough iron, you do have enough iron, you don't have this, you do have this. Yeah, it's better to get a complete signal or a complete picture as opposed to these 25 lab tests and, versus 150 to 160. Okay, so let's talk about a patient in this situation, right? So she's 49. She came in this patient. She came to me about 8 months post right knee arthroscopy for a meniscal tear. The surgery wasn't that complicated. The rehab was, the muscles, the exercise and everything she'd done, all was appropriate. But the tissue quality around her knee, particularly like the medial retinaculum, the patellar tendon, the local fascial planes, right? That pes anserine where the goose foot, the adductors were locked on. None of that has ever fully regained the quality it had before the surgery. She still has a lot of tenderness in her adductors. Her IT bands just, never lets go. The tissue palpates as inadequately resilient, right? It doesn't, it'll give and then it kind of slodges back. It just feels like something went wrong with the surgery, even though it has nothing to do with the surgery. So the tissue yields easily, but it doesn't spring. The elastic recoil that should have returned with healing hasn't. She reports that her joints feel unstable, even on a structurally sound repair, right? I mean, the doctor's gone back in, taken x-rays. I mean, she even had an MRI. She's been told the surgery was successful and her instability is psychological, right? We always blame the patient. Um, Now, her previous labs showed ferritin at 29 and transferrin saturation at 14%. Her primary care physician started her on oral iron supplementation 4 months ago. At the follow up, ferritin had risen to 41, but the transferrin saturation remained at 16%, so way down there. So something's going wrong. The iron numbers moved in the right direction. The tissue quality didn't change, and the clinical picture still reads as functionally iron restricted despite repletion. Now, the missing piece in this case was serum copper had never even been checked, right? I mean, because they don't add that one in. That's you really have to twist the doc's arm, and part of that's insurance and stuff. So when you're going through insurance, that's why I tell people like, look, it's important for you to have your information, and you might have to just pay that out of your pocket, right? With the Superpower or the Function Health or any of these other ones, but sometimes it's very worth it because you get a clear picture, a complete picture.
Yeah.
So we asked the doc, hey, can we run a full trace metal panel? And copper came back at 68 micrograms per deciliter, below the lower reference limit of 72, right? It's supposed to be 72 to 166. Ceruloplasmin was at the low end of the reference range. The iron supplementation had been providing the raw material. The copper deficiency meant ceruloplasmin couldn't convert ferrous iron to ferric iron efficiently, right? So you don't have the right kind of iron. Well, if it's not right kind of, if it's not that Fe3 plus that's very happy to take electrons, then it's not active, right? The more pluses or minus something has, the more active it's going to be. Transferrin saturation stayed low, and the iron couldn't reach the tissues. At the same time, the lysyl oxidase impairment from the low copper meant that the new collagen being laid down in the healing tissue wasn't being properly cross-linked. The tissue had bulk without architecture, so it looked pretty normally. Like, oh yeah, things appear normal. But when she would be doing her exercises or working out or walking or doing the other things she was doing, she just wasn't coming back because she didn't have that full netting effect and that strength effect of the tissue. It just wasn't strong. It was, lots of fibers doing that. So the intervention, obviously, copper supplementation added alongside continued iron. We checked the zinc. Zinc was checked and found borderline low. We added that as well, right? Because the copper and the zinc, and oftentimes we'll see that if you supplement with one, the other one tends to drop. So you have to supplement those together. Now, selenium had been added after the thyroid episode, which had been relevant earlier in her history, right? Manual therapy continued, but now the technique priorities shifted. Like, again, you have to shift your approach. Less aggressive loading, right? And so not only from my standpoint, but what the exercises she's doing. We got her off the heavier weights and said, I know you're trying to push it and you think you're so many months past, 8 months past your knee, but you need to pull back and wait until this stuff is actually built correctly. So we did more sustained fascial work at a low load, right? I lightened up specifically to give the new cross-linking collagen time to organize without being disrupted by tensile forces it wasn't yet architecturally ready to handle, right? So I didn't want to be the person messing it up by really doing lots of different, different mobilizations or this, that, the other. We went and worked other places. I mean, certainly there's a whole body problem here. So we worked on areas in other places. But again, her whole body has a copper problem and a zinc problem. And especially with that thyroid, we're definitely looking at saying how much of this thyroid, how much thyroid problem do you really have, and how much of that is just you have iron or you don't have iron, but your thyroid's not supported because even there you can't use it. All right. So about 12 weeks into this, copper was up to 94 micrograms per deciliter, and you'll see this a lot when you test people. If they've been supplementing, they often go shooting past the norm. So sometimes you have to tell people, okay, you can back off a little bit on your copper. She's fine there, but transferrin saturation, 22%. We're getting there. Tissue quality measurably improved on palpation, right? I really felt like I was working with real tissue that could handle it. Elastic recoil was returning. Better differentiation throughout the periarticular fascia. It much more felt like her knee was stable. And her sets of instability resolved, not because anything structural changed in the repair per se, not like in the repair itself, but because the fascial and ligamentous structure around the joint finally had the molecular cross-linking to provide the appropriate proprioceptive feedback and the mechanical stiffness she had been missing, right? You need a certain amount of mechanical stiffness that your knee resists motion. Otherwise, it's a little bit like an induced Ehlers-Danlos situation where tissue goes, wah, 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 and that, then that causes more inflammation, more damage. So there we go.
That's really cool. That's really cool. And it's neat because we've talked more in more general terms over the years about how nutrition is really important, but it's really neat to be able to get into like this is this, and how they look because I mean, we're talking like 10 years ago, I'd tell my patients, we need to check your micronutrients and see what they are. And some of them came back when the doctors were like, what are the micronutrients? And I'm like, I mean, Google them, right? Like, but now we have something we can be like, I want this, I want this. But like with your patient there, it looks like a joint problem. Really, it's a nutrition problem. It's that connective tissue architecture that doesn't have the scaffolding, right? The crosslinks to be able to transmit that proprioception signal. So, I mean, what looks
Exactly.
like a problem with the surgery is really like, yeah, but we have this whole body problem that's been in there probably longer than the injury anyway, that needs to be fixed so that she can heal properly and become better.
And certainly in the past, I've assumed, hey, this is a doctor. They're going to do this this initial groundwork, and that's not necessarily true. Partially, again, because of the limitations of insurance, the limitations of time. You're trying to time up treatments. You only see the orthopod so many times. Um, and a lot of times the time between their initial meeting and then whatever intervention the doc wants to do isn't enough time for full reports to come through, or the doctor's office doesn't have time. But that's why it's really important for us. I mean, we are trying to be those people that provide that health envelope in making sure that uh, metabolic function is there, right? There's no
Hmm.
intervention at any level of medicine, whether that's our osteopathic manual, exercise, rehab, um, higher level, whether that's peptides, whether that's PRP, whether that's a surgery, stem cell. None of these things are going to work if the basic metabolism isn't there. And so before people are spending all this other money on these other things, we really need to go through this. Let's make sure you have this part. Then let's make sure you have the sleep part. Then let's make sure, like, if you're gonna do hyaluronic acid, you gotta have these other things in there. So yeah, it really is. It was a wake up call to me because of course people are like, well, that's not your job. It's like, well, when I'm doing manual therapy and the patient can't respond to what I'm doing, and I feel their body part or whatever, I go, this isn't normal. Then that's my job. And if no one else is looking at it, somebody's got to do it. Somebody has to be part of the team and make sure to take the time to go through the basics. And our mentor Bear used to say that all the time. He says, an expert is someone who doesn't screw up the basics. Well, cell metabolism is the basics, so
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, and
very
if
good.
that stuff doesn't get fixed, they're just waiting for another injury to get down the road because that cross linking isn't anywhere where like it should
Right,
be.
right. There
So
are
as time goes
all
on,
sorts
things
of
are going to get
injuries.
worse. Yep.
Right.
And I know with a lot of my patients or clients, depending on what state I'm in, uh, I see them more often than the doctor does. Right. So I'm going to have more of a relationship with them. I know their tissue because a lot of doctors don't touch their patients because they're not messing with the elasticity and seeing that stuff. So yeah, so it's something that I think is very naturally that we'd think, this is you're not feeling like you normally do, or this isn't how most of my patients present. So maybe we should check this out. So
And
absolutely,
those and those patients who don't, you treat them once or twice, and you're like, okay, this isn't going right.
yeah.
They're not making the right statements. Okay, so what we can do, right? Three things to carry forward. First, again, back to tissue quality is a biochemical read as much as a mechanical one. When fascia lasts elastic recoil, when it yields but doesn't spring, that is not always a sign of chronic restriction or fibrosis from overuse. That doesn't mean cross friction massage. It may be a sign that lysyl oxidase is impaired by copper deficiency, and the molecular crosslinks that give the tissue its architectural integrity were never fully assembled. The palpatory distinction is specific. Restricted tissue resists and then releases, right? Copper deficient tissue gives without resistance, but also without rebound. So if you've been working tissue that falls into the second category and wondering why the mechanical work isn't producing durable improvement, and again, this goes back to patients as well. Like, hey, if you're rolling on the ball or rolling on the foam roller or using the massage gun or using the stick, you have to recognize this as well. That you're going to say, yeah, my tissue just doesn't, yeah, that's weird. It's not normal. So copper is always a question worth raising with the patient's physician. Or, as I kind of pointed out, there are these on-demand complete blood panels that I think are very valuable, right? Because you don't get those from you can go to the doctor and you have to twist their arm and they have to try and come up with a justification as to why they're going to order all these tests. Um, by ordering it for yourself, you don't need anybody's. You just say, I just want to know the status, my general status of my health. I want to know my cell metabolism. I want to know what's going on, just in general.
And a lot
So
of times that can be done quicker.
much quicker. Yeah, we're talking. Like for example, superpower and function health. They use for us. It's Quest Labs. I was able to get an appointment. Appointments were available like within a day or two. Just getting one that was before 11 a.m. because your first test you should do so we could get proper cortisol measurements. They wanted it before 11 o'clock. Plus, you have to fast. So the early morning one took me a couple weeks, and then I got one. So I was like, okay, I was willing to wait a couple weeks. But yeah, that's a couple weeks. That's sooner than I would have been able to see a doctor. So
Right.
and then I would have had to pay my copay, and I would have had to pay for the doctor, and then yeah. Anyway, okay. Now, number two, when iron repletion isn't moving the transferrin saturation, ask about copper before increasing the iron dose. It's not always not enough iron. Ceruloplasmin plasmin is the transport enabler for iron, right? Low copper means low ceruloplasmin. Plasmin. And that which, low ceruloplasmin means iron sits in cells rather than circulating to tissues, regardless of how much supplemental iron is provided. You can be choking to death on iron and it's not going to work. The copper iron relationship is one of the most clinically underappreciated interactions in trace metal biochemistry, and it explains a subset of persistent functional iron deficiency that won't respond to iron supplementation no matter how diligently it's pursued. And I have patients saying, "Oh, I got to get up at 5 a.m. and I got to take it. And I got to take it with the vitamin C, right? So there's I'm taking it with lemons, and you can't do this, and you can't do that. I can't eat for 2 or 3 hours." And it's like, well, yes, that optimizes it. But honestly, if you have to optimize it that much and it's still not making a difference, okay, we got problems. Let's look
Yeah.
deeper here.
Might be at the barking up the wrong tree.
Yeah, exactly. Or you took care of that problem. Now there's a second problem. Okay. Third, muscle that chronically resists relaxation despite appropriate mechanical treatment deserves a magnesium conversation, right? So we had the first one that it doesn't resist too much, but it's just not elastic. This one is just rigid, right? And that's, let's talk about magnesium in that situation. Not because magnesium supplementation replaces manual work. It doesn't, right? The magnesium's not going to miraculously get your IT band complex to let go or your gluteal aponeurosis. But because if the circuit pump, right, is running on insufficient magnesium ATP, the biochemical mechanism for calcium clearance from the muscle cell is impaired, and the cell will return to a partially contracted state between sessions, regardless of what the mechanical work achieves. The manual therapy is changing the mechanical environment correctly. The biochemistry is resetting it right back to where it was. This is a very solvable problem, and the magnesium is a straightforward intervention with a well-characterized mechanism. And that's, and this is at all levels of in the calcium thing. Let's talk about that for just a second. I want to do a podcast on this about how important just the calcium is, but your body has, only has so much calcium available to it. Otherwise, it has to take it out of your bones. Well, if this circuit pump is not running efficiently, right, your magnesium ATP is low, guess who's going to have osteopenia? So this is another thing in osteopenia and osteoporosis. That might be the indication that these people are running on insufficient magnesium ATP, and that just simply by adding magnesium in will stop the excessive conjugation of bone calcium. It's one of the
amazing.
problems. Yeah, it's like one of those problems that there are secondary problems we won't even know that we're addressing if you don't understand that whole thing. That's why we're talking about it, right? We all need to understand this. Okay, so another aspect of that. Okay. Well, so and that's really what I wanted to cover. I mean, the tissue you treat wasn't assembled from nothing, right? You're constantly being regenerated, redone, right? And your tissue was forged atom by atom, enzyme by enzyme, cross-link by cross-link from raw materials that include metallic elements that the body cannot synthesize and must obtain continuously from diet and metabolism. Iron for the mitochondria and the oxygen transport, copper for the crosslinks that give connective tissue its architecture, and for the ceruloplasmin that makes iron transport possible. Zinc for the fibroblasts that make collagen and that make the collagen, and for the gene expression machinery that drives every repair response. You got to make the right proteins, basically. Magnesium, you need magnesium to activate the ATP that powers all of it. Selenium to protect the cell from oxidative cost of inflammation, right? That selenium is really useful in protecting you and keeping you from aging your tissue at a more rapid rate. Now, manganese for the cartilage and the synovial fluid that makes joints move. Highly, highly important. That's what keeps you from going bone on bone. And so if you lose that, you're going to hit bone on bone much earlier. So something worth, and again, the patients who need a total knee or something else, something of that sort. Remember, they also have to build new bone around that prosthesis. right? Or when the doctor goes in and cuts tissue, they have to rebuild. They have got to have all these, you know, extra these other micronutrients. So when the forge runs low on any of these, the body keeps building, but it builds with compromised materials. The tissue has less cross-linking, less structural integrity, slower repair, weaker immune response, and less resilience under load. And the manual therapy that should be generating durable structural change is working in a biological environment that doesn't have what it needs to sustain the changes being made. So the most useful question after a session where the tissue didn't respond the way it should have been isn't, what technique should I have used? What did I do wrong? It's, does this tissue have what it needs to be built correctly? And if the answer is no, that's a conversation with the patient and ideally with their physician that has a specific biochemical correctable answer. But again, that could be the whole physician interaction thing, especially these days, it's so difficult to get into docs. A lot of times it's just better for the patient to go and say, I want this information for me, because, you know, supplementation, given the correct data, people can make decisions off that. And there are AIs that help give you an idea of what you should be doing. I personally, in my clinic, what I offer is that I've actually trained my AIs, and I use my AIs in a specific manner to go through their information and try and just like draw out as much information as possible out of the information. I also put in the patient history, and I take care and put a lot of other things. So there's also the interaction when somebody comes and sees me as a patient, that I'm taking that information I'm gathering from them, the information I'm gathering from touching them and looking at this and saying, well, they also have this, this, and this. And then I put that all through my AI, and it comes out with better answers than just the standard responses. Remember, AIs are built on what are the 10,000 or 100,000 standard responses? Well, those get more weight. Mine is specifically, I've added to it. I've added the osteopathic machinery to it so that my version of AI can understand it better and answer the questions a little bit more deeply. So something that we offer in our clinic. And I think that all of us that do this need to have ideas about this. And again, so that we can be better team members of the medical team, because the doc can't always get to them. Docs are overwhelmed with so many things, and everyone's operating at the top of their abilities. And so we need to be at the top of our game to help the doc out. So there you go. That's my 2 cents. Anyway. All right.
That's awesome.
Well, I'm Neil O'Neill, and this is OsteoSignal. Thanks for joining me, Autumn, Brent. And until next time, pay attention to the signals.
Thanks, Neil.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of OsteoSignal. For more information, visit pursuitpt.com or pursuitperformancetraining.com. Want to show your support for the podcast? Like this episode, hit that follow or subscribe button, and leave us a comment or review. Remember, this podcast is for informational purposes only. Please consult your healthcare provider regarding any medical procedure. Copyright 2026, Neil O'Neill, PT.